Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now we begin. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be followed, but there's no one there? To walk through a place where every corner feels like it's hiding something, but you can't see it. It was late, too late. The kind of late when the world is asleep, and the only sound you hear is your own breath. The city was quiet, unnervingly so. I should have been home by now, tucked in my bed with the hum of a heater and the soft glow of a street lamp outside my window. But instead I was walking in the dark through streets that seemed oddly unfamiliar, despite having walked them 1,000 times before. The district I was in had an old charm, one that most people would have called picturesque. But I had learned over the years that not all beauty is innocent. There were houses here, old houses, each one standing as a silent monument to the past. Some of them still held the faint scent of wood and age, others had a more peculiar smell, like something rotting just beneath the surface. I couldn't help but feel like they were watching me, even as I tried not to look at them. I had no reason to be here. No real reason at all, except that it was a walk I had often taken before, in better times. The streets were narrow, lined with tall, narrow buildings that looked like they had stories to tell. The kind of stories that make the hairs on your neck stand up, even if you're just passing by. There were whispers here, whispers you couldn't hear in the light of day, but they were there. Quiet, persistent, like a presence that lurked just outside your vision. When that night, something was different. I had been walking for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long shadows that stretched out and then snapped back as the light bounced erratically. I pulled my jacket tighter around my body, suddenly feeling cold despite the mild February air. Then I heard it. At first, it was just a faint rustle, the kind of sound you might mistake for wind. But the wind wasn't blowing, and there was something off about it. The sound grew louder, more defined. A soft scraping, as if something was brushing against the pavement behind me. I stopped walking, breath catching in my throat. My eyes darted over my shoulder. The street was empty. No one. Just shadows. But the sound, it didn't stop. It continued, growing louder with every passing second, like footsteps creeping closer. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks. But then, just as I turned to keep walking, I felt it. A chill. It spread through my spine and I froze, rooted to the spot. The air around me shifted, thickened, as though the night itself was pressing in, suffocating me with its weight. I swallowed hard, eyes scanning the street ahead of me. There was nothing but the dark and the endless row of houses, all with their empty windows, all with their stories I would never know. I turned down another alley, the quiet stretching out before me like a blackened wound. And that's when I saw it. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. But no, the shadow was moving. Slowly, purposefully. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to face it. But my feet moved anyway. Closer and closer. Then in the distance I heard the sound again, closer this time. It wasn't the rustling of wind. It was a footstep. Real. Alive. I started to run. But my feet didn't take me anywhere fast enough. The shadow followed, moving with me. The silence was broken now, replaced by the rapid thudding of my heart in my ears. And in that silence, something else, a whisper, so soft it could have been the wind, or something else entirely. Turn back. I froze, standing still in the middle of the alley. The voice, it came from nowhere. Yet it was so real, so clear, that it felt like it was spoken right in my ear. I wanted to turn back. I wanted to flee, but I couldn't move. Something was keeping me here. The shadow was closer now, just behind me. I could feel its presence, the way it pressed against the air, suffocating it. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. Something told me I would never be able to unsee what was there. I kept running, but the world around me was changing. The buildings, those familiar houses, no longer felt like homes. They loomed towering above me, their windows like empty eyes, watching, waiting. I wasn't alone, and I knew with a sickening certainty that I never would be again. My legs felt heavy as I stumbled forward, each step filled with the weight of dread. The shadow, whatever it was still behind me, its presence suffocating, but I couldn't bring myself to look back. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that crawling sensation, as if something was watching my every move. The air seemed to thicken with every breath I took. My heart hammered against my chest, as though trying to break free from the terror that gripped me. Each corner I turned only led to more of the same, dark alleys, empty windows, and houses that seemed to close in on me. It was as if I had entered another world entirely, one where the rules I knew no longer applied. I wanted to scream, to call out, but I couldn't. Someone had stolen my voice. The only sound was the relentless echo of my footsteps on the cobbled street. And still the shadow followed. I tried to quicken my pace, but my feet felt as though they were stuck in place. Every time I thought I was gaining distance, it was as if the alley stretched on forever, elongating, mocking me. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But it was. In the distance, I saw a faint light, just a glimmer, barely visible through the darkened streets. A street lamp. I focused on it, willing myself to reach it. But even as I did, the light flickered. The shadows twisted beneath it, dancing like they had a life of their own. I reached it anyway, but it wasn't enough. The air grew colder, biting at my skin as I stood beneath the light. My breath formed clouds in the freezing air. Turn back. The voice. It was there again. That whisper. I spun around, but the alley behind me was empty. The shadow was gone, at least I thought it was. I let out a shaky breath, trying to steady my nerves. I was wrong. It was never gone. It had just learned how to move in silence, how to blend in with the dark. I had to get out. I had to get out. But then a noise broke through the silence. A creaking, low, deep. It came from one of the houses. I turned toward the sound, my eyes fixed on the old building at the corner. It was tall, crumbling, with broken windows and a rotting door that hung ajar. And there in the doorway I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. I could barely make out its shape, but I could feel its gaze on me, piercing, like it could see straight through me. My body tensed, my pulse quickened. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, its silhouette blurred by the flickering light. But then it took a step forward. Just one. It was slow, deliberate. I took a step back. The chill of fear wrapped around my spine like icy fingers. Suddenly the silence shattered. A door slammed open and the figure stepped out, its movements jerky, unnatural. It wasn't walking. It was dragging itself, as though its limbs didn't quite understand how to move properly. It reached out a hand that was too pale, too long, grasping at the air, then at me. I froze. My entire body screamed at me to run, to escape, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its eyes. Empty, hollow. They glowed faintly like two dying embers. And there, in the silence between our breaths, I heard the whisper again. Turn back. I took a step back slowly, my mind screaming for me to move faster, but my feet wouldn't obey. The creature, if that's what it was, began to make a noise, low and guttural. A laugh. No, it wasn't a laugh. It was something worse, something that crawled under your skin and made your blood run cold. Get away. The words were not spoken aloud. They were not said by the figure in front of me. They came from inside my head. A voice that didn't belong, yet it felt so familiar. It felt like my voice. I blinked hard, trying to clear my mind, to break the hold this place had on me. But when I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. Vanished, like it had never been there in the first place. I stood alone in the cold, trembling. The street lamp above me flickered again, casting more shadows, stretching them across the alley like fingers reaching for me. The sound. It was there again, the soft scraping noise that had followed me since the beginning. The one that had sounded like footsteps. But now it was louder. Closer. More urgent. I wasn't alone. I never had been. I turned and began to walk again, faster this time, even though I knew it wouldn't be enough. Something was coming. I could feel it. And with every step I took, the streets became more twisted, more unfamiliar. The buildings loomed higher, and the air felt thicker, like it was alive, breathing with me. The light from the street lamp flickered once more. And in that moment I saw it. The shadow. It was no longer just behind me. It was in front of me now. Closer. Closer than ever. I stopped dead in my tracks, unable to breathe, unable to think. The shadow, it wasn't just following anymore. It was waiting. Looming just ahead of me, its form indistinct, shifting like smoke, yet solid in a way that made my skin crawl. I could feel its presence, pressing against me like the air had turned to stone. The street had changed, though I couldn't say when it happened. It used to be a familiar place, an alley lined with old houses, all with peeling paint and rusted railings. Now it felt like a labyrinth, each turn leading to more darkness, more uncertainty. The buildings towered above me, their windows now gaping voids, as though they were watching, waiting for something, someone. Amigo, I couldn't remember the last time I had seen a door or a window that wasn't broken or a sign that told me where I was. Everything seemed to blur together, becoming one indistinct mass of wood, stone, and shadow. The only thing real was the feeling, cold, suffocating, that sense of being watched, of being trapped. The scraping sound was closer now. The noise that had once seemed distant, so far away, now felt like it was right behind me. My heart was in my throat as I dared to glance over my shoulder. But there was nothing there, nothing but the ever-growing darkness. And still the shadow in front of me remained. A chill raced down my spine, and I stumbled backward. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs. I could feel it now. It was getting closer. The light from the street lamp above me flickered once more. For just a brief second, I thought I saw it, a face. A face within the shadow, something dark, twisted. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly, like the coals of a fire long since gone out. And its mouth, wide and stretched, grinned with something sharp and hungry. Turn back. The voice came again, louder this time. It was my own voice, but it didn't sound like me. It sounded like something else. Something older. Something that had lived far longer than I had. I took a step forward, then another, my legs barely able to move. I needed to get away, to escape. But the deeper I went into the alley, the tighter the walls seemed to close in. The darkness pressed in, curling around me like tendrils, pulling me in. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing against the wall of one of the buildings. The texture was rough, jagged, like the stone had been scraped raw. I jerked my hand back, but something lifted. The wall moved. The bricks beneath my fingers didn't just feel cold. They felt like they were breathing, expanding and contracting, as though the entire building were alive. I backed away from it, my mind spiraling. No, this wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But as I looked around, I realized the alley was changing. The space wasn't just closing in, it was warping, shifting like a nightmare. One moment the buildings were solid, standing tall and proud. The next they were leaning in, slanting at angles that defied logic, as though the laws of physics had stopped working entirely. The scrape behind me came again, this time followed by a low, guttural whisper, a sound that vibrated deep within my chest, rattling my bones. It was a word, or what sounded like one. Closer, the voice was far too deep, far too old to belong to anything human. I turned again, this time a full, desperate spin. And there it was, the shadow had moved. It was right in front of me now, no longer a vague, shifting form, but something more solid. A shape and outline darker than the darkness itself. Its edges blurred in a way that made my stomach turn. I couldn't see its full form, but I could feel its eyes, those empty, glowing eyes locked on me. It was studying me. I could feel its hunger, its curiosity, as if I were nothing more than prey. Without thinking, I took off running again, my feet pounding against the uneven cobblestones, the scrape of the shadow's movements echoing in my ears. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground was sucking me in, dragging me down into the earth. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, it was always right behind me. That cold, breathless presence that refused to let me go. I turned a corner, hoping for something familiar, for a way out, but instead, I was met with more of the same. A narrow, dimly lit street, lined with houses that all seemed to watch me, their empty windows like gaping mouths. I turned another corner, and then another. It was all the same. All the streets, all the alleys, everything had started to twist together, merging into one. No exit, no escape. I stopped, gasping for air, my hands clutching my chest. My heart was racing. My thoughts were a mess. There had to be something that could help me. I reached out to the nearest building, this one older than the others, its wooden exterior worn and cracked. As my hand touched the surface, I felt it, a shudder deep within the structure. And then the soft creak of wood, as if something was moving inside, something heavy, something that should not have been there. I jerked my hand back, the echo of the creak reverberating in my head. But before I could move, the whisper came again. "You're already here." I froze. The voice, it wasn't just in my head this time. It was inside the walls. Coming from the buildings themselves, from the very ground beneath me. It was everywhere. I took a step back, eyes darting around the alley. The air was thick, suffocating. I couldn't see the shadow anymore, but I knew it was there, waiting. Then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, soft and uneven, growing closer. I wasn't alone, and I realized with horrifying clarity that I never had been. I stood frozen, every nerve screaming at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, grew louder. They weren't just footsteps, they were heavy. Each step seemed to vibrate through the ground, shaking my bones. My heart hammered wildly against my chest, its rhythm completely out of sync with the terror that flooded my veins. The air felt thick now, pressing against me, suffocating me, as if the very atmosphere had turned into something living, something malicious. I couldn't see the source of the footsteps. I couldn't even tell where they were coming from. The sound seemed to echo from every direction, reverberating off the walls that surrounded me. It was as if the buildings themselves were alive, amplifying the noise, making it impossible to pinpoint its origin. And with each passing moment, the steps got closer. I glanced up at the dark sky above. The street lamp flickered again, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch far beyond their natural length. It felt as though the darkness itself was pulling on the light, like a puppeteer tugging at the strings of a marionette. I quickly turned my gaze back to the alley, trying to focus on the present, but the ground beneath me had begun to shift. The cobblestones had changed, no longer just rough and uneven, they now appeared cracked, broken, as if something was pulling at the earth itself from below. A low hum vibrated through the ground, a deep, unsettling sound that rattled my teeth. The footsteps stopped. I wasn't alone anymore. The shadow, it was closer now. I could feel it even before I saw it. A presence so thick, it felt like a weight pushing down on my chest. It wasn't just an outline anymore. It was there, solid, real, and yet still somehow unreal. I wanted to move, to flee, but my legs were rooted to the spot. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything, but I was paralyzed. The air around me grew colder, the temperature dropping in an instant. I could see my breath now, the fog swirling in front of me as the chill wrapped around my throat, tightening with every shallow breath. And then it spoke. The voice, a low, rasping whisper, as if coming from the very walls around me. "You can't leave," it said, the words slithering into my mind like a cold wind. I took a step back, but before my foot could even touch the ground, the alley seemed to shift again, bending and contorting around me. The walls lined inward, closing the space around me like a trap. I turned, desperate to find an escape, but each turn led me deeper into the labyrinth. There was no end, no exit, only more darkness, more suffocating shadows. The footsteps started again, this time faster, louder. It was as if whatever it was closing in on me, no longer content to wait, no longer content to remain hidden in the darkness. The sound of movement became more distinct, more defined. The scraping noise from before, like nails on glass, was back. But now it was followed by something else. A voice, not a whisper, but a growl. Low and guttural, the words were impossible to make out, but the sound was unmistakable. The shadow, it was getting closer. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my feet slapping against the broken ground as I sprinted down the alley, the sound of my footsteps blending with the chaos around me. The hum beneath the earth grew louder, the vibrations in my chest becoming unbearable. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how desperately I tried to escape, I couldn't outrun the feeling. The shadow was still there, following, always just behind me. The air grew thicker, the walls closer. The distance between the light from the street lamp and the dark corners of the alley seemed to stretch further and further away. The growl came again, this time louder. I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through me, the sheer power of the sound overwhelming every sense I had left. And then there it was. A figure. It emerged from the shadows, or perhaps it had always been there, waiting. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form long and twisted, like something that didn't belong in the world of the living. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its limbs were elongated, stretching unnaturally, as though they had been pulled and twisted beyond reason. Its eyes, those eyes glowing faintly like two dying embers, burned with an unnatural hunger. Its mouth opened, impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth far too sharp, far too numerous to belong to anything human. The growl came again, a low rumble that reverberated through the alley. It was here. The air was thick with the stench of decay now, the smell of something rotting and ancient. My stomach churned. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the thing that had stepped out of the shadows, the thing that was staring back at me. And then it moved. Not fast. No, it wasn't in a hurry. Its movements were slow, deliberate. It took a step forward, its long, spindly limbs creaking, the sound of bones shifting and grinding together. My feet finally found their movement, but it was too late. I turned and bolted, my legs burning with the effort, but I could already feel its presence behind me. Every step I took, it followed. Every breath I tried to steady, it pushed back, cold and suffocating. I reached the end of the alley, but there was no escape. The wall, it wasn't there before, had appeared. Solid, unyielding. I slammed into it, the impact jolting through my body. I turned to face the shadow again. It was there, just a few feet away now, close enough that I could see the faint glow of its eyes. I was trapped, and then the growl stopped. The thing just stood there, its dark form looming, as if it were studying me, deciding. The silence between us was unbearable. It was suffocating, pressing in on me like the walls were closing in. My mind raced, trying to find some way out, some way to escape, but nothing made sense anymore. The world had turned upside down, warped and twisted beyond recognition. There was only the shadow. And me. The air around me was getting colder. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble again, the hum deep inside the earth vibrating through me. I could feel something rising, something ancient, something far older than this place. The figure finally moved again. But this time it didn't come closer. It reached out. I froze. My body locked in place, unable to move, unable to run. The shadow's hand stretched toward me, long, bony fingers reaching for my throat. But the moment it touched me, everything changed. The moment its cold, unnatural fingers brushed against my skin, the world seemed to fracture, like glass cracking under a heavy weight. Time slowed. The air around me thickened to a suffocating weight, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, sliding like wet clay. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadow's fingers, sharp like the tips of knives, slowly tightened around my throat. It wasn't just physical pain, though. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at the very edges of my consciousness, pulling at the threads of my thoughts, unraveling my sense of self. I could feel it, the hollowing. It was taking something from me. My soul, my memories, my very essence. I was being drained. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It was a part of me, a part that I never knew existed, reaching into the dark corners of my mind, unearthing things I had long buried. Its grip tightened. I gasped, choking for air, but there was none. The shadows wrapped tighter, squeezing the very breath from my lungs as the whispers returned. They were louder now, not just in my ears, but inside my head. You belong to me now, the voice rasped, low and final. It wasn't the creature's voice, it was something older, something deeper. Something that had always been here. In the walls, in the earth, and me. I struggled, but there was no escape. My hands flailed weakly, scraping against the cold, solid walls that surrounded me. The ground underfoot continued to shift, buckling and rising like it was alive. My surroundings had completely melted into a void. There were no streets, no alleys, no buildings. Only darkness and the suffocating pull of the creature's presence. I could feel my body weakening, my muscles growing sluggish. My vision blurred, the edges of reality warping into a sickening, swirling black. The thing was feeding on me, I realized. Not just physically, but psychologically, pulling at the threads of my sanity. Well, you can't fight me. You can't escape me, the voice whispered again, each word digging into my skull like a hot poker. I couldn't tell if it was the creature or something else speaking. It was all the same now. All of it. I could barely hold on to myself, but there was a spark of defiance in me, something deep within, something that refused to let go. With what little strength I had left, I clenched my fists, desperate to find something, anything to fight back with. My mind was a haze, but I knew that if I let go, if I allowed myself to be consumed, there would be no coming back. Then I remembered. I wasn't alone. The voice in my head, the one that had been whispering since the moment I stepped into this cursed place, suddenly screamed in my mind, "Run." It wasn't my voice, but it was as if something inside of me had awakened. Something forgotten, something buried, had finally risen to the surface. I didn't have time to question it. With every ounce of willpower left, I summoned every last bit of strength and slammed my hands onto the shadow's grip. The cold was unbearable, biting deep into my skin, but I didn't stop. I pushed against it with everything I had. The creature flinched, its form wavered. It was afraid. With a roar, I shoved it back, stumbling backward as its grip loosened just enough for me to gasp in a ragged breath. The shadow howled, its voice becoming more distorted, its form beginning to flicker in and out of existence. It was losing its hold on me. I took my chance. I turned, my legs moving on their own, faster than I'd ever thought possible, and I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I didn't care if I was running into more of the same darkness. I just knew I had to get away. But the alley was different now. The walls weren't closing in on me. They weren't alive anymore. The shifting, warping feeling was gone. For the first time, the world felt real again. The oppressive weight of the creature's presence was no longer suffocating me. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would collapse under me. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. And then I saw it. A faint glow ahead. A light. It flickered like a distant star, but it was real. It was alive. It was an exit. It was freedom. With every last ounce of strength, I pushed myself forward, my vision beginning to clear. The walls no longer shifted. The street was normal again. It was just a street. A street I knew well. I reached the light. It was a street lamp, the same one I had passed when I first stepped into the alley. But it wasn't like before. It felt stable. I turned to look behind me, expecting the shadow to be there to follow me. But there was nothing. The alley was empty. Silent. I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming. If I was still stuck in the nightmare. Or if I had really escaped. But one thing was clear, the shadow was gone. I took one step, then another. And I didn't look back. Not this time. But deep down I could still hear the whispers. A soft, distant murmur at the back of my mind. You can never leave. And as I walked into the night, I wondered, had I truly escaped? Or had I simply walked into another part of the same nightmare? I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like, but if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. It all started with a question. A simple question that I couldn't shake from my mind. What would you do if you found something that didn't belong? I never considered it an answer, just a fleeting thought, until I found myself standing in the attic of my family's old house, staring at the strange object lying in front of me. The dust in the air shimmered, disturbed by my every movement. The attic was always a place I avoided, a dark, cold, and forgotten space tucked away in the corners of my family home, filled with things no one ever bothered to touch. But that day it was different. Something called to me. It wasn't a voice, not a sound, but a feeling. And that feeling led me here. I knelt down, the creaking of the wooden floor beneath me the only sound in the silence. My fingers brushed against the cool, metallic surface of the key. It was old, rusted in places, and etched with symbols I didn't recognize. The shape of the key was unlike anything I had ever seen before, curiously intricate. It seemed as though it didn't belong to any door in this house. I felt an odd chill as my fingertips made contact with the cold iron, a strange sensation creeping up my spine. Why had it been hidden here? My mind raced with questions, but I couldn't seem to pull my hand away. The key felt different. I had a strong, unsettling feeling that it wasn't meant to be touched. As if I was stirring something, waking something that should remain asleep. But it was too late. I had already touched it. And when I did, that's when the first of many strange things began to happen. At first it was subtle. A faint whisper in the air, barely audible, like a breeze passing through the room. But there was no wind. The attic was still. I pulled my hand away from the key, but the sound didn't fade. In fact, it grew louder, closer. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. I glanced around, but there was nothing. The attic remained as it always had been, dark, dusty, and neglected. But the feeling lingered. Someone was watching me. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. I had always been the curious type, the kind who dug into family histories and uncovered long-buried secrets. But even I couldn't deny the heaviness in the air. I was never one to believe in ghosts or curses, but now I wasn't so sure. I carefully placed the key in my pocket, unable to leave it where I had found it. I wasn't sure why, but something about the key made me feel like I needed to take it with me. Something told me I couldn't leave it behind. As I descended the attic stairs, the silence seemed to follow me. The house felt different now, more oppressive. The air was thick with something I couldn't name. I glanced over my shoulder. The attic door was still wide open, as though inviting me to return. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a mistake. Had I triggered something? The thought gnawed at me as I made my way back to the main floor. I set the key on the table in the kitchen, my hands still shaking. I stared at it as if waiting for it to reveal some sort of answer. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was overreacting, that it was just a key, just an old piece of metal. But there was something about it, something that didn't feel right. I glanced up at the hallway, where shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. The house was quiet, too quiet. It felt as if the air had grown heavier, thicker, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. The first sound came from upstairs. At first I thought it was the old house settling, but then it came again, a soft, rhythmic creak. I felt my pulse quicken. I knew that sound. I had heard it all my life. It was the sound of footsteps. Someone or something was walking above me. I glanced at the stairs. The noise continued, slow and deliberate, as if it was waiting for me to follow. I gripped the edge of the table. My body froze and my mind screamed at me to do something, anything. But all I could do was stare at the stairs, my eyes fixed on the dark corridor at the top. Then in the stillness, a soft, barely noticeable sound reached my ears. A whisper. Come to me. The words were so faint I almost didn't hear them, but they were clear enough to make my skin crawl. The whisper was soft but filled with an undeniable urgency, as though it wanted something, needed me. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I had imagined it. My heart raced, my breath shallow. The footsteps above me stopped. Everything went quiet. I shouldn't have gone upstairs. I should have left the house, thrown the key away, and never looked back. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something had already begun, something far beyond my understanding. And now I had no choice but to see it through to the end. With each step I took toward the stairs, the air grew colder, heavier. The whisper grew louder, its tone shifting from invitation to command. Come to me, and I obeyed. I took the first step. But I didn't know then that I had just unlocked something that was never meant to be disturbed. I reached the top of the stairs, every step creaking beneath my weight, each sound amplifying in the suffocating silence of the house. The whisper, soft and insistent, echoed in my mind as though it was pulling me deeper into the house, deeper into whatever secret it was hiding. My hand trembled as it rested on the banister. The dark hallway ahead of me was shrouded in shadows that seemed to move on their own, shifting and twisting like something alive. I had always believed that the mind could play tricks on you in the dark, that the mind could make you imagine things that weren't there. But there was something different this time. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something real. I glanced back over my shoulder. The stairs behind me seemed further away than they had been just moments before, as though they were receding into a distance I couldn't quite reach. The hallway stretched out before me, the dim light from the window at the end casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, the only sound in the stillness. And then I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic creak of footsteps. But this time it wasn't just above me. It was all around me from the other rooms, as though the house itself was moving. The walls seemed to press in closer, the air thick with something dark, something that wasn't supposed to be there. My fingers tightened around the railing, the cold wood biting into my skin. I swallowed, trying to steady my breath, but the fear was already settling deep within me, crawling beneath my skin. The key in my pocket felt heavier, pressing against my side like a constant reminder of the thing I had set in motion. I took another step forward, my heart pounding louder than the creaks of the floorboards. I couldn't just stand there, could I? The house was alive with whispers, with footsteps that weren't my own. I needed to know what was happening, what I had disturbed. I moved cautiously down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, but the sound of the house around me grew louder, more insistent. I felt it now, an oppressive presence. It was like something was watching me from the dark corners, waiting, but I couldn't see it. I couldn't place it. A sudden cold draft swept through the hallway, ruffling the curtains at the far end. The room at the end of the hall, the one that had always been locked, seemed to draw me toward it. It was the only room I hadn't dared to enter in all my years of living here, the only door I had never opened. But now it felt like that was the place I had to go. I glanced down at the key, still in my hand, its cold metal slick with sweat from my grip. It almost seemed to hum, vibrating with a strange energy that made my stomach turn. What was I doing? I was just about to turn the handle when a voice, a low, guttural growl, erupted from the darkness behind me. I froze, my body stiff with fear. The air seemed to snap, the temperature dropping instantly. I spun around, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The hallway behind me was still as empty as it had been moments before. But I could feel it now, whatever was there. It was close. I took a step back, the cold creeping into my bones. My breath came in short, jagged gasps, and my hand shook violently as I reached for the door again. The whispering was louder now, filling the room, drowning out all other sounds. Come to me. The words were no longer faint, no longer a whisper in the wind. They were a command, a pull I couldn't resist. My body moved before my mind could catch up, my hand turning the cold metal knob. The door creaked open, revealing a room I had never seen before, even though I knew it was always there. The room was smaller than I had imagined, its walls lined with shelves filled with books, papers, and odd trinkets. But it was the smell that struck me first, musty, stale, like something had been locked away for years. A thick layer of dust covered everything, undisturbed, as if no one had entered the room in decades. But the most unsettling thing was the air. It was thick, heavier than the rest of the house, suffocating almost. And in the center of the room there was a pedestal. On it, resting under a dirty cloth, was a small, worn chest. It was the chest that called to me, that drew me in. I stepped forward, my feet moving almost of their own accord, as though something invisible was guiding me. The key in my pocket seemed to throb in time with my heartbeat. I reached out with a trembling hand and lifted the cloth from the chest. A shiver ran down my spine. The chest was beautiful, its surface carved with intricate symbols, the same symbols that adorned the key. I didn't know why, but I felt as though I knew exactly what this chest was, what it had been intended for. And for the first time, I realized that I had been meant to find it. I had been meant to unlock it. But as my fingers brushed against the chest, a sudden, sharp sound broke through the thick silence, an inhuman screech, followed by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from deep within the walls themselves. The house shook. The floor beneath me trembled. I pulled my hand back, my heart racing as panic surged through me. What had I just done? The chest was no longer just an object. It was a trap, and now it was too late to escape. I spun around, but the doorway was no longer there. The hallway had disappeared, and the room was now encased in shadow, the walls closing in around me. The air felt suffocating, as though I were drowning in it. I was no longer alone. I could feel it moving, breathing, creeping up behind me. Something was coming, something I could not see but could sense all too clearly. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. My heart was hammering in my chest, each beat reverberating through my entire body. My breaths were shallow, quick, as though I was struggling to pull air from a room that was quickly becoming too small. The shadows around me seemed to stretch longer, reaching for me with each passing second. And yet it was the silence that was the most unnerving. The footsteps I had heard before had stopped, leaving only the haunting absence of sound, a suffocating stillness that seemed to press against my ears. I turned in every direction, but the room was unchanged. The chest, the pedestal, the dust, everything was as it had been. Yet I knew something was different. Something had shifted. The air felt heavier now, thick with the sense of something waiting, something watching. I could feel the presence, but I couldn't see it. The silence stretched out, and I took a tentative step backward. The floor beneath me groaned, but it was softer now, as if it had given way under the weight of some unseen force. My gaze darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any flicker of the unnatural that had just been there. I stepped to the side, my mind screaming at me to leave, to run, to escape this suffocating, oppressive room. But my legs refused to move. They felt rooted to the floor, heavy as if they were no longer my own. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, trying to gather myself. This isn't real, I told myself. This is just my imagination. I've been up too long, too stressed. This is just a nightmare. But when I opened my eyes again, the shadows weren't quite the same. They were deeper, as though the room was being consumed by the darkness, or maybe the darkness was consuming me. It started as a whisper, so soft I almost missed it. A voice, but not a voice in the traditional sense. It was more like a thought, an echo in my mind that seemed to seep from the walls. Come closer. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My feet refused to obey, paralyzed by the sensation of being drawn toward the center of the room. The darkness shifted. It was subtle at first, a flicker here, a slight distortion there. The shadows near the pedestal began to writhe, undulating like something alive. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to step back, but again, my body refused to respond. I was trapped in a moment that felt like it was stretching on forever. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly I could see my breath in front of me, thin clouds of mist swirling around my face. My skin prickled, every nerve ending alight with an overwhelming sense of terror. The shadows, those writhing, twisting things, began to take shape. Something was emerging from the dark. A figure. At first it was only a vague silhouette, its features indistinguishable, blending into the blackness. But slowly, agonizingly slowly, it began to sharpen. It was humanoid in form, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch longer than should have been possible. Its skin, or what should have been skin, was a sickly shade of gray, mottled with what looked like patches of decay. Its eyes, were blacker than the shadows themselves, absorbing all light, giving nothing back. I could feel the thing's gaze on me, even though its eyes had no visible pupils. It was a gaze that cut through me, stripping away any shred of rational thought. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat had constricted so tight I could hardly breathe. My hands were trembling violently, and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to get out of there before whatever that thing was, whatever it wanted, was too much. But it was too late. The figure began to move, a slow, deliberate motion that made the air around it shudder. I took a step backward, desperate, but my feet were like lead. Each movement I made was slower, harder, as though my very will to escape was being drained by the creature before me. Closer, the whisper again, but it was no longer a suggestion. It was a command, a demand. The creature's voice, the same one I had heard earlier, deep and guttural, was now inside my head, crawling through my mind, twisting my thoughts, rooting them in place. My fingers brushed against the key in my pocket. I could feel its weight, cold and metallic, a reminder of how I had gotten here, of how I had unlocked this nightmare. The room was spinning around me, the shadows pressing in closer, suffocating the very air I tried to breathe. The figure was almost upon me now, its twisted form looming just inches away. I could smell it now, a sickly sweet odor like rotting meat, like something dead that had been left to decay for far too long. I forced my legs to move. Move, damn it, move. But they wouldn't. They couldn't. It was then that I saw it. The jest, the thing I had uncovered. The thing that had called me here. The lid was open now, revealing the dark void within. It wasn't just a chest anymore. It was a portal. The shadows that had spilled from it had coiled around the room, surrounding me like a cage. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was nothing more than a spectator in my own body, trapped by the thing before me, by whatever power was trying to pull me into the chest, into the dark space that had been sealed away for so long. And then the creature reached out. It wasn't its hands that terrified me, though. It was its fingers. Long, impossibly long, and tipped with nails that gleamed like broken shards of glass. It reached for me, and as it did, the temperature dropped even further, the very air around me freezing, biting into my skin. I closed my eyes, unable to look at it any longer. I should have never touched that key. I should have never opened that chest. And then everything went black. But I could still hear the whisper. I still feel its presence. The thing in the shadows. It wasn't done with me yet. I woke with a start, my body jerking upright, as though it had been pulled from some deep, suffocating pit. My heart was racing, thundering in my chest, a rapid and erratic pulse that felt as though it could shatter my ribs. My breath was shallow, fogging in front of me, and I could taste the bitter cold on my tongue. For a moment, I wasn't sure where I was. The familiar surroundings of my living room, dimly lit and still, slowly came into focus. The couch, the coffee table, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. The only thing out of place was the overwhelming sense of unease that clung to me, heavier than it had been before. I glanced around, my mind scrambling to make sense of what had happened. The key, the jest, the dark, writhing figure that had reached for me. I could still feel the phantom chill of its fingers, a coldness that had sunk deep into my bones. Was it a dream? A nightmare brought on by exhaustion, too many sleepless nights. I rubbed my face with both hands, trying to shake off the disorienting feeling of disconnection between what I had experienced and what my eyes told me was reality. I tried to stand, but my legs felt unsteady, as though they were still bound by invisible chains. My gaze darted around the room, looking for any sign of what had happened. Any clue that I wasn't just imagining everything. The dim light from the window revealed no sign of disturbance. The dust on the floor remained undisturbed. No signs of the creature. no ominous shadows lingering in the corners. But the air was different. It was colder than it should have been, the temperature unnaturally low for the time of year. My breath hung in the air, a steady stream of fog that didn't dissipate. And there was something else, something more subtle but unmistakable. Okay. I reached for my jacket, still hanging on the coat rack by the door. It was there in the pocket where I had left it earlier, heavy and cold to the touch. I pulled it out, my fingers brushing against the intricate details of its metal form. The chill from the key spread up my arm, a creeping, unnerving sensation. It's not real, I thought. Well, it can't be. This is just my mind playing tricks on me. But even as the words formed in my mind, a faint rustling sound reached my ears. It was a soft, almost imperceptible noise, like something shifting in the darkness. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The rustling grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the hallway, slow, deliberate, the sound of footsteps, but not quite footsteps. A dragging sound, as though something was scraping against the floor, inching closer. I clenched the key in my hand, my fingers tightening around it as if it could offer me some protection. But the more I thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. A key couldn't protect me. A key didn't hold any power over whatever that thing had been. Still, I couldn't ignore the pull. The undeniable pull toward it. Another sound, closer now. A sharp creak from the hallway. It sounded like the door to the room was slowly opening, but I hadn't heard anyone approach. No footsteps, no movement. Just that eerie scrape of something heavy dragging along the floor. I stood frozen, the key still clenched in my hand. The shadows at the end of the hallway began to shift, as though they were taking on a life of their own. The edges of the light seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, as though the darkness was seeping in from every crack. The room felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick and stifling. My pulse quickened again, the overwhelming sensation of being watched creeping up my spine. I could feel it now, that familiar presence from earlier, the thing that had been in the shadows. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. I took a tentative step toward the hallway, my mind a jumble of thoughts and doubts. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't fight it. I had no idea what I was dealing with, only that I couldn't just sit here and wait for it to find me. But my legs were like lead, each step harder than the last, as though the darkness was dragging me back with invisible hands. The scraping sound was louder now. Whatever it was had reached the door frame, and it was waiting, as though it knew I was too afraid to move any further. The room was now a battlefield, the forces of light and dark waging a silent war. The shadows stretched longer, creeping along the floor, reaching toward me. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the thing in the hallway or of the key in my hand. Was it the key that had brought this upon me? Had it unlocked something I wasn't meant to know? Had it been the catalyst for everything that had happened? Suddenly the hallway light flickered. Once, twice, and then the door creaked open just a fraction, an invitation that sent a jolt of terror through my veins. The rustling sound stopped, and the silence that followed felt worse than anything I had experienced so far. It was a waiting silence, the kind that precedes something terrible. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, to never look back. But the door had opened just enough for something to be visible, a silhouette. No detail, just a shape standing motionless, its presence hanging in the air like a poison, ready to infect everything in its path. And then it spoke. A voice deep and guttural, a low hum that made my skin crawl. You shouldn't have opened it. I froze. The key in my hand grew colder still, as though it was responding to the voice. The thing was real. It was here, and I had no idea how to stop it. I stood there, my mind racing, my body frozen in place. The voice that came from the silhouette in the hallway was like a thunderclap, the kind that rattles your bones and makes everything in the room vibrate. My chest felt tight, as though the air itself had thickened, becoming a physical weight pressing down on me. You shouldn't have opened it, the voice repeated, and this time it was more than just a whisper. It was a command, a warning laced with a terrifying sense of finality. It seemed to reverberate around the room, sinking into every corner, every shadow, filling the space with an oppressive, suffocating atmosphere. The darkness around the figure seemed to grow, expanding and twisting, as though it were alive, pulling at the very air I breathed. I wanted to move. I needed to move. But my legs were still locked in place, my feet rooted to the ground, as though the floor itself had decided to hold me captive. My hand still clutched the key, the cold metal digging into my palm, its weight suddenly far heavier than before. The silhouette in the doorway didn't move. It was waiting, its shape shifting ever so slightly in the dim light, as if it were adjusting to my presence. It seemed to grow taller, broader, as though it was feeding off my fear, drawing strength from my terror. Was it real? My mind kept repeating the question, the rational part of me screaming that this couldn't be happening. There had to be some explanation, some logical reason for this. But the more I thought about it, the less real everything seemed. The shadows, the cold air, the way the room felt like it was closing in on me. I could still hear that low, guttural voice echoing in my head, repeating the same phrase over and over. You shouldn't have opened it. The words took on a new meaning with each repetition, their significance growing clearer. It wasn't just a warning. It was a curse. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the figure in the hallway. The key in my hand felt colder still, as though it had absorbed the very essence of the thing before me. It was the key to something dark, something powerful, but I had no idea what that something was. I had to get out. I had to leave before it was too late. But as I turned to make my way to the door, I saw the shadows in the room begin to shift. They moved in response to my every action, stretching and contorting like living things. I could feel them closing in on me, pressing from all sides, threatening to swallow me whole. I could hear the scrape of something against the floor again. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, just beneath the surface of the silence. The scraping was getting louder, closer. It was as though the very walls of the house were closing in, pushing me toward the figure in the hallway, forcing me to confront it. Don't run, the voice whispered, the sound of it like fingernails on glass. You can't escape. I looked down at the key in my hand. It was still cold, still heavy. I didn't know what it unlocked, but I knew that somehow it was connected to this thing in the hallway. This, whatever it was. And I realized something that made my blood run cold. The key wasn't just a symbol of power. It was a key to a door I had already opened. A door that shouldn't have been opened. I lifted the key higher, staring at it in disbelief. The intricate patterns on its surface began to shimmer, the metal pulsing with a sickly glow that made my stomach churn. As I stared at it, I felt the room around me shift again. The shadows seemed to become more solid, more defined, as though they were responding to the key, reacting to it. The figure in the hallway didn't move, but I could feel its presence, feel it pressing in on me, pushing me to make a choice. The air was thick with anticipation, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. And then I heard it. A soft click. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the turning of a lock. It came from somewhere behind me, from deep within the house. And in that moment I knew what it meant. The key had unlocked something. Something more than just the door to the hallway. It had unlocked the door to something far darker, something far more dangerous. And the thing in the hallway wasn't waiting for me to make a decision. It was waiting for me to fail. I turned back to the hallway, my legs still shaky, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was still there, but it was different now. Its shape had become more defined, more solid, as though it were pulling itself out of the shadows. I could see its eyes, black, soulless voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. Its face was a mask of contorted, distorted features, as though it had been carved from the darkness itself. And then it moved. It stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate. Each step it took made the floorboards groan and creak, the sound echoing in the silence like a death knell. The shadows shifted again, crawling toward me, wrapping around my legs, tugging at me, trying to pull me toward the thing in the hallway. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The thing spoke again, its voice deep and gravelly, like it was coming from the very depths of the earth. You cannot stop what has already begun. I didn't know what to do. The key in my hand was still cold, but its presence was no longer reassuring. It felt like a curse now, a mark of my failure, of my choice. I had opened the door. I had let it in. And now there was no turning back. The thing took another step, and I felt my heart stop. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.